The exhibit is called Topaz Collages, One Family's Experience. That's on my father's side. And most of you here know the story of Topaz, but for those who are unfamiliar with the historical aspect, I just want to go briefly over it. Topaz was one of the 10 concentration camps that was established in 1942 after President Roosevelt declared Executive Order 9066. And in that order, he said all Japanese, whether they were citizens or not, had to leave the West Coast and move into one of these camps or to go further in the country. And so that was a devastating act. That it's really hard to think that it was possible to do it at that point. And my father and mother and sister lived best. So everyone that lived in the Bay Area, that's Richmond, Berkeley, Oakland, Alameda, whatever, went to Topaz. And so they had a house here that they owned, and from there they went in. One of the things that they could not bring into camp were cameras, simply because I don't think the government wanted the internees to take photographs of the camps that would reflect a negative aspect of this executive order. So many children who are born in Topaz don't have photographs of themselves as infants and young children. But I had two uncles, my Uncle Tom and my Uncle Jiggs, who had joined the armed forces, and they could go into camp with their cameras. And I find it really ironic. They joined the armed forces to protect this country, yet they have to visit their family, their mother, their other relatives behind barbed wires. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. So they took the photographs of my family. And it wasn't until many years later how appreciative and how grateful that we have these photographs. So many of them do not have photographs of themselves as youngsters. After they came back, they gave these photographs to my mother, and she put them in scrapbook. And this is part of my memory of growing up. I remember looking at the scrapbook and seeing these. I became very familiar, and my mother was very open in terms of what these photographs represented. And my mother passed away in 2020. And I had been going back and forth, as Jill said, taking care of her. So the last time I left the Bay Area was February of 2020. And I wanted to, and I went back to San Diego, but I wanted to use my time in a profitable way. I didn't want it just the time to go back. I wanted to show something. And I had always wanted to do something with these photographs. And I said, well, this is really a good time to do it. And I had taken a class from the local quilt group here in Berkeley called Collages and Quilts. And I love collages and I love quilts. And to be able to combine those two mediums was wonderful. And the teacher was Denise Ogawa Miller. Some of you who know her, and she's a wonderful textile artist. She taught the class, and how wonderful it is that we both share the same ethnicity, the history, and that taking her class resulted in the Topaz collages, so that it was a great connection there. And what I learned from the class was that she had us all start with black felt. So all of my collages start with a foundation of black felt, and Daiso has wonderful felt. So I buy that, and then on that, I sewed. You could sew on there. You could sew materials, fabric, paper, whatever. And I did multiple layers of paint, acrylics, crayons, inks, whatever I needed to get the kind of result I wanted. So it's a multi-layered process, and it's somebody asked me, well, how do you teach, or how do you, it's hard. It's something that comes internally that you do. And so I started that, and I began with the first one, and it came so easily because I knew exactly what to do. And I was really pleased, and I did second, third, fourth. And I was really pleased with it, and it was not my purpose to share it from anyone outside my home. I was just doing it for myself. But I felt that it presented the camp in a different way that I had never seen it in other mediums. So I contacted the museum, Topaz Museum, and sent them photos. And their response was, contact friends of Topaz and Ruth Sasaki. And so I sent it to Ruth. And at that point, I needed to have some validation. I needed to have an objective a voice to tell me what they thought of it, not from my perspective. And so Ruth was the best person to contact. Ruth gave me the validation that I needed at that point of time, and she put it on her website. And from that website, people could see it, and Visions saw it, and they gave me a contract based on the 4 collages. And for me to be able to even to think about grasping that I would have a show that would be shown in a museum was just wonderful. And so that contract usually is for 2, they give it to you. You sign the contract, 2 years later it's shown. So in the meantime, I kept going and going. And I finished 8 more, so I had a total of 12. And so initially it was going to be just for the wall, but since I had 12, they gave me a whole room by myself. And it was so rewarding because most of the people that came to Visions had no idea. They didn't know about the story. So it was a learning experience for them. And they said they were moved by the collage, but they were also understanding what had happened to the Japanese in 1942. It was shown in Visions, and then it was shown, as Jill said, at the San Diego Historical Society, and most of those were Japanese people, and they understood what the history was. But coming back to here was wonderful. I mean, I feel like I'm bringing my collages back to its home because this community has such a close contact with Topaz. So this is a particularly meaningful exhibit for me to make. And my family lived in a home in Berkeley on Fulton Street, and my grandfather had bought this home many years ago under great conflict from people that lived there. They didn't want any Asians living there, and one of the neighbors offered to buy the property because they didn't want, and my grandfather, and half of that my grandfather had built because he was a carpenter, and they were worried that it would become a Japantown where lots of Asian Japanese would come in and rent. And so at the time of 1942, my father, my mother, my brother, and my grandparents lived in this home. And many people who were evacuated stayed there for a time and moved on, and they used the basement to put all of their items in during the war. And I remember my mother saying, we gathered all of the items and we went upstairs to the biggest room and put all of these things there and locked it and left, and they didn't know if they were going to come back or not. Nobody knew what was going to happen to them. So that to make that was, it's a terrible thing to have to adjust to follow what the president said. They came from this room house, multi-kitchens, multi-bathrooms, a big backyard. And from there, they had to go to Tan Fran, and they had to stay in a horse stable with mattresses that they filled with straw, and how degrading that must have been for my family and all the others that had to make that transition from their own homes to Topaz. So I could feel that. And there's one thing, when I was doing the collages and I was doing, choosing the paper for each of the barracks, the planks and stuff, I didn't realize how internalized living in a barrack had become. I initially started this pretty objectively, like, oh, my parents lived in Topaz and so forth. And I remember finishing those 4, and I went to the hallway and I propped them up in the hallway and I looked at it, and I suddenly became really emotional that realizing the extent of that existence for my family and others, and I was very very emotional. And that's when I felt that I could share it beyond my own home. So when they stayed at Tan Fran for a number of months, they got on a very hot old train, and I don't think many of the attorneys knew where they were going. So that headed toward Utah, and at Salt Lake they got off and they got on a bus, and from there they went into Delta. So the first collage. And I was thinking of visions. They didn't know what the layout was of the camps. So the first one is a long view. There were barracks, and we were assigned block 7, barrack 11, room 3, and that was our address for 3 years. And they were in blocks, and there were like 12 to 14 barracks in each block. Okay, the next one. And when my mom and dad family arrived in Topaz, my mother was in her last trimester of her pregnancy, and she went into labor at the end of September, and the hospital hadn't been built. So she had to deliver in the laundry room 4, and she says it was on the floor. Some other accounts said it was on a table, but I believe my mother. And she said she didn't know how she would survive that, because there was sand coming in. These barracks were not built well, and she could see the sand coming in. The abiding thing was that we had a real doctor there, Dr. Jeanie Fujita, who assisted in the delivery, and it was an uncomplicated delivery, and that baby was born, and I put there in a crate or a fruit thing, because there was nothing else to put that baby in. And my father was so grateful for her existence and assistance that he named that baby Eugenia. And that baby was the first baby born in camp, and I was that baby. I was the first baby born in Topaz. And Eugenia Fujita was always part of my life. Whenever I say Eugenia, I always think of Dr. Eugenia Fujita, but I knew nothing about her. And my mother didn't know, and I didn't know anything about her. So it was like a void in my life that someone who was so much part of my life, I knew nothing about. I only knew that she assisted in the delivery. And then about a year ago, I got an email from someone who said he was the child of Dr. Eugenia Fujita. And I asked him, would you send me a picture of her? And finally, after 80 plus years, I saw what she looked like, a lovely, slender doctor. And last August, and his name was Joseph Yamagihara Zawa, and he emailed me again, and he lives in New Jersey, and he works for Goldman Sachs, and he happened to be in the LA area, and he wanted to visit me. So he drove from LA to San Diego, and that was the first time that I had a connection with the family. And he's a wonderful person. And that void that I had all these years was filled. And I had casually mentioned that I would be bringing the collages up here and sharing it at J-Sei. And it was just a comment that I made. And then I got another email. He says, well, when is it scheduled? He said, I'm going to put it on my schedule. I said, you're kidding me. I was like, you're kidding me. You would come from New Jersey just to see my show and hear my talk. And he flew in on the 14th of this month. And we had lunch with him with my family. And I cannot tell Joe, that was such a wonderful thing. His father was also a doctor, and his grandfather was a dentist in Topaz. So maybe some of you who have connections may know the family. So maybe after my talk, you'll want to talk to him. So that void I had so many years is fully filled, and more so. So I'm so grateful for Joe to reach out to me. So this little baby that Dr. Fujita delivered was born behind barbed wires, lived the first 3 years behind barbed wires, learned how to crawl on that cement floor, learned how to walk, learned how to talk. And for all the mothers that had the babies in camp, it was a really challenging experience, because in the small 20 by 30 foot barrack, there was no sink, there was no a toilet, there was no heating element, there was no refrigerator. So how do you take care of an infant and all the other children under those circumstances? In addition, the barracks were not fully insulated, so that you could hear from one end of the barrack to the other. These are 100 square foot barracks. And I could see my mother having to carry me through the night because she didn't want to have me cry and disturb the other internees. And how many times did my brother have to go to the bathroom, and that she'd have to take him out, walk out in that sandy air and bring him to the bathroom. It was an extremely difficult situation. This is a collage that hasn't been shown in the other exhibit, simply because I discovered this photo after the exhibit. I had gone through my files, and I remember this extremely well growing up. Showing, if you look at it, you think, oh, an Asian mother enjoying her baby. The only thing there would be the symbolic single light bulb. But other than that, you would think it was just an ordinary picture. You take it, step back a couple of feet, and then you get the full context of the picture. And there is the picture, but is in Barrack 11, in the Topaz concentration camp, behind barbed wires and the watchtower. So it's a totally different perspective. This is the second one that I did of that initial 4 collages that I completed. And I think the mothers had to hold their babies all the time, because there was no paved areas. And even if she had a stroller, it would be really difficult to get around, because it would make the sand go up. And so I think there were very, very difficult times there. This is the iconic photo that has been used. It was shown at Rosie the Riveter, and it is on the trading card. Every state park has a trading card, And so this is one of them, showing my mother and myself. And this was the first one that I did. Actually, there's two of these in the exhibit, one smaller and one larger. The smaller one is the very first collage that I completed. And this is Jeanie and Glenn. Not a very good place to have children. It was unhealthy for them to bring all that. There was no parks, no grass areas, no really place to play. And so very barren environment to have children in. Okay. And I wanted to have one collage where we had the whole family together. The only abiding thing of the Topaz for our family that we were all together. Many of the families were divided, husbands were separated. But I had my father, there's my mother, myself, my brother, and my grandfather. So we were all together, and that's really important because what had happened after they left camp was not the same family situation. This is my grandfather, Oishi, and the initial photograph was really small. It was like 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches, so I couldn't see his face. And then when I enlarged it, I could see his face, and my heart just sort of broke. And it was not one of anger, it was one of sadness and disillusionment and disappointment and wondering what was going to happen to him. My grandfather came here at an early age, worked really hard, and was able to buy land in rural Richmond, and he started a wholesale garden carnation nursery. And for him to have to leave this, not knowing what would happen if he would ever come back, must have been so sad, and not knowing was a tragedy for him. In talking to my cousin Larry, he was saying that before they left, they gathered a lot of things and brought them down in the packing shed. And so my grandmother, when she came from a fairly wealthy family, and so she brought Ohina dolls and ceramic items and Amari plates and baskets and scrolls and kimonos, and they took all of these, brought it downstairs in the packing shed where they processed the carnations. And in the packing shed, there was one storage unit where they put all of these things and put a lock on it and left. So many people who went to camp lost so many items, wonderful Japanese items that were lost, stolen, destroyed. But when they came back, they were able to come back to the nursery, everything was intact. So all of these things that were my grandmother's were still there. And these are the items that belong to me that I have chosen, and they're part of my heritage, my grandma's heritage, and they are in my home in Berkeley, and they will be given down to my ancestors. So we're really grateful to have that. And this was not a part of the original show. This is a new one. This is the third one, I think, yeah. This is my brother, Glenn, holding a wooden rifle, and I purposely put a watchtower there, and they had armed guards, and there were 7 watchtowers around the camp. And I was wondering if my mother or my brother ever asked my mother, what was that for? What are those men doing up there with guns? Those weapons were pointed not at the people coming into camp, but people pointing at the internees trying to get out, or think they thought were going on. One of the internees, Jeanie, went too close to the fence one day. He was trying to retrieve his dog, and he was shot and killed. and that garden was removed, but I don't think there was a real extensive examination of what the unit was. And I want my brother to be remembered. He graduated from UC Berkeley, then went to India in the Peace Corps, and came back, and their mission there was so good that it was noted in the congressional efforts. And then it was something that he should not have done. He told the draft that he was back, thinking that he would be absolved, that he wouldn't have to. But the recruiting in Berkeley was extremely low because people were saying they were conscientious objectors, so their numbers were really, really low. And so despite the fact that my brother gave 2 years to Peace Corps, he was drafted, and he served 2 more years in Vietnam. And he was a wonderful person, and he was to die at an early age, and I don't want him forgotten. This is a photo of my father, and it's the only photo. It was not in our possession. I was going through the UC archives of photographs, and I came upon this, and I said, "Oh, this looks like my dad." And I said, "Mom, is this Dad?" And she said, "Yeah." And I couldn't tell what it was initially, but it was people unloading trees to be planted. My father was really well educated. He went to Oklahoma LNL, and I was wondering, why would a Japanese in the 1920s go to a college in the Deep South? But their family didn't let their heritage block them. And after he graduated, went back to Berkeley, UC Berkeley, and took classes in landscape architect. And for that reason, he was assigned supervisor of landscaping, and this was his crew, and that crew planted hundreds, thousands of trees and shrubs into the camp. I'm thinking of the visions of what's the beginning, that was the overview of the barracks, and this would be the ending. And it showed, I wanted to go back to where it started. This was the floor, a laundry room floor. And the only thing left there was, the foundation, cracked foundation. And all those trees, I looked beyond, and all those trees and bushes were non-existent. The only thing growing there was the greasewood, and that's the only plant that grows in that alkaline soil. I walked in that alkaline soil. It was like walking through powdered sugar. It was white and sterile, and then going to the camp, going to Topaz camp, I didn't realize that each barrack, each block had a recreation hall, and that was really the heart of camp. And Block 7, where my family was the block that had the art school that Professor Abata started with Mr. Hebe. Hundreds and hundreds of evacuees took art classes there. And in the other recreation halls, there was a sewing place where women could go. There's a craft place, and women made those famous jewelry with the shells and the origami flowers. If you see pictures of the camps, you might see funerals or weddings, and they're flowers. Those are not real flowers. Those are origami flowers that the ladies made. Then they had Boys and Girls Scouts. They had a Japanese singing and dancing. They had a room for the Japanese games and that the men could play. They had libraries, and of course sports was a big thing. So looking out from where I was there, which is barren, and you would never know that a society of 8,500 people lived there many years ago. It was a vibrant society. And I just had such a full heart that these J-Seis and J-Seis were so resilient. and not only resilient, but the Japanese aesthetics and creativity came out, and I just had such an admiration. And many of them had Japanese gardens and victory gardens, and many of the men scavenged for pieces of wood, and they made chairs and tables and closets and bureaus, and even I saw some beautiful obotsudan Japanese shrines that were made, wonderful, exciting things. So I left that day with a really full heart, and so proud of my heritage, and so proud to be Japanese on that day. This was the end of the exhibit in Visions and in the Historical Society. And the fourth one I did was getting back to the Berkeley House. And this isn't a part of it, but this is the exhibit that I'm showing this very first time. And this is the Berkeley House as it looks today. And it was 5 generation. And I wanted to tell a little bit about what happened to my family after they left camp. They're fortunate to have to go back to the Berkeley House. Someone had overseen it, that taxes were paid, and so my mother, my father, myself, and my brother and uncle could go back. Many of the internees didn't have a place to go back to. They couldn't rent. There's really hostile discrimination against the Japanese at that time. And so we're really lucky to have this to go back to. And it would be absolutely horrendous if my family didn't have this to go back to, and if they had to search for a place to stay. For my mother, she entered Topaz pregnant and she left Topaz pregnant. And so she gave birth in July 1946. My father was not feeling well in camp. He went back to Berkeley, went back to see Dr. Wayama, who was the family doctor, and he said that he had terminal prostate cancer. So my mother gave birth in July. My father died 3 months later in September. That left her with a new infant, 2 the kids, but we had the Berkeley House. We always felt that we had a roof, that we wouldn't be out in the streets. And that house was owned by my uncle at that time. My Uncle Ernie, who was well off, who paid the taxes, who paid for upkeeps, and it was his wish that my mother would be able to stay there, our family. So I grew up there. It was a wonderful neighborhood, wonderful a place to grow up. And I went to LeConte Elementary School, and I didn't feel any discrimination in there. And so, and my mother, I showed here, in the last 4 years of her life, she was bedridden, but she was so happy and at peace that she could stay there at the house. This was her home for decades and decades. And she died peacefully at the age of 104. She was the last of 8 siblings to have lived, and she had the most challenging life. So we're really, really grateful. My uncle owned the property. Unfortunately, when he died, he didn't leave a will. He wanted my mom to have the house, so what happened was that I bought the property. My mother and I bought the property, and I paid for the mortgage for many, many years, and all by myself, because my husband had died about the same time as my father had died, and he would have been proud of me that I bought the house, and when I got the last thing, that no more mortgage due, it was such a feeling of satisfaction because I did it myself. And my daughter lives around the corner, and Kevin, they come and watch over the house, and my grandsons, who are in the picture, come over every day, and Kevin takes care of my mother's cat, Mika, right in the front. And so this will be kept in my family. I will be handed down to my family, and I will respect the history of this house and be grateful. Be grateful that we have it. The last screen is of my husband who passed away many years ago, and his name was Tetsuo Kashima, and he was a educator and a very active in the community, and I wanted him to be part of it. He was well loved, respected, and greatly missed. And he would have been really proud to be here. And I wanted him to be part of this. I wanted him to be recognized. So it was a wonderful life. Wendy and Peter. I see trees of green, carnations too. I see them bloom for me and you, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I see hot houses against clouds of white, the long hard days, the dark sacred nights, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. The smiles of aunts and uncles, so pretty in my mind, are also on the faces of grandparents going by. I see cousin bunching flowers, saying, how do you do? They're really saying, I love you. I hear babies cry. I watch them grow. They'll learn much more than I'll ever know. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Yes, I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Oh, yeah. Thank you, Jeanie. Thank you very much.
As far as the difficulty of the coming back from the internment camp, Jeanie was very fortunate. They had their house on Carlton Street. We had both of my grandparents were also in the internment camps with my mother, and we actually had a person across the street from us on Carlton who was an African American, and we actually paid him to keep an eye on our houses over there. So the houses were still available for us. Unfortunately, a lot of the furniture and ovens and everything else were taken. But the house was still there. We had we had other friends in Berkeley, but they weren't able to, keep an eye on everything for us. But it was very difficult. Both my grandparents were in the internment camps. One was um, in the doctor's quarters with my mother. My mother actually watched both sets. And I also found out that I can't really track this one down. I had at least three other relatives in Topaz, but I haven't been able to track them down. So,
Actually, it wasn't to share. It was something that I wanted to do. I needed to have some creative outlet, and it was never my intention that it would be shown, that it would end up an exhibit. So this is wonderful to be able to share my families. I don't speak for the whole. I just speak for my family and their experience.
First of all, thank you so much for sharing this artwork and your experience with us. I had a couple questions. I guess I knew you were really young when you left the camp, but I was curious if you have any memories of it at all. Um, and also, I was just curious about your process as far as the materials you used and how you put them together.
Okay, as I said before, no, I don't have any. I was 3. I don't have any remembrances. As I said to you, the technique was the felt, was the basis, and Renovations has great texture. The Renovations catalog, I went through that, and I was getting all kinds of textures for the panels, and that was my main source in terms of the paper. And I used threads, I used acrylics, I used crayons, inks, whatever supplies that I needed to get the result, I used. So it was a multi-layered process, and I enjoyed that a lot, being able to contour it and so forth. So, and I forgot to mention that I was going through the list of the people that are signed up for today, and I had talked about our neighborhood in Berkeley, and it was a wonderful neighborhood, really wonderful memories. And there were 3 names: the Dowdikins. They are our neighbors in the 50s. Can you believe that? And I remember that family so well. They were wonderful. I remember the mother, and to see that name and to make that connection here at this point of time is just wonderful. And I want to see you later because you are in my heart. And I have such good memories of your family and our neighborhood. I want to say something about Kaz. She came and visited my mother. She was the most frequent visitor, and my mother really enjoyed having her visit, and I appreciated that very much. And when I did the laundry room, I knew that Kaz was in Topaz. I didn't know where to start. And I looked through various books, Minokuo's and Professor Bata's, but I asked her specific questions about the laundry room. What was the flooring? Was it cement? Was it wood? And her recollection was that she remembered the water pooling. And I said, oh, well, it must have been cement. So that's why I did a cement foundation, which was the correct, because I went there and it was cement. So Kaz has been a real wonderful force for my mom, and I will always appreciate her coming to visit her during those last years.
Jeanie, can you tell the audience about the connection to the nursery? Because Wendy's song, she changed the words and referred to the flowers.
The carnation, yes, because I said my grandfather Oishi had started a wholesale carnation nursery in Richmond. And by the time 1942 came, it was pretty well established and doing well. For him to have to leave at that point and not knowing what was happening must have been so sad for him. But we do have a long history with the nursery.
And that history will be restored. Some of the greenhouse will be refabricated and shared in the Richmond area to tell the history of the Japanese Americans in the nursery business. So it's really something wonderful to look forward to, telling more of this history in the place that it happened. So.